Hi everybody, hope y'all are doing well. Happy Halloween. As you can see this year, I'm dressed as a desperate hoe. AKA myself, don't mind the pimple, that's part of the costume. It's also extremely hot, so I have to constantly be drying myself. So if you see me like sweat at any point in this video, that's not my, well, that is my problem. But deal with it. Also, I'm sick, so if I sound a little bit nasally or congested, that's because I'm dying. I'm good. Anyways, let us talk about the books that I read over the past 2 months. I read 7 books in the past 2 months, which is standard for me. So I'll be talking about those. The first 2 books that I want to talk about are My Brother, These Frickin' Dogs! Jesus mother. Hello, Mr. Dog. Yes. It ain't that deep. Right, so where was I? So the first 2 books that I read were My Brother's Husband duology. This is a 2-volume manga series about a man named Yaichi who lives with his daughter Kana, and this guy named Mike turns up at their doorstep. Mike was Yaichi's brother's husband, but his brother Roiji passed away. Now, him and Roiji were both twins, and when they were around 15 years old, Roiji came out as gay to Yaichi, and Yaichi, because of homophobia, sort of slowly but surely distanced himself from his brother, and by the time Roiji left Japan to move to Canada, they completely lost contact with each other. After Roiji's death, his husband Mike comes to Japan to spend about 3 weeks with Kana and Yaichi because he just wants to sort of like come full circle and make amends with the family, something that his husband wasn't able to do when he was alive. The story is really cute. It's essentially just, him, Yaichi, he's the main protagonist really, he's the one whose perspective we predominantly follow, and it's really about him just sort of unlearning homophobia and sort of using this opportunity of reconnecting with his brother's husband, or connecting for the first time with his brother's husband, and sort of dealing with the regret that he kind of feels about, not talking with his brother, and the grief of having lost his brother and all that kind of stuff. It's a really, really wonderful series. It sounds very heartbreaking, but it's actually very, very lighthearted and funny. Junguro Tagami does a brilliant job with the illustrations. I love the little girl character. Her character was really important because she was there to kind of illustrate to the reader, wow. She was there to kind of illustrate to the reader that homophobia is learned, and that kids are not naturally homophobic, but rather they learn it from the adults in their lives. I'm sorry if I keep wiping myself, y'all, but y'all just gonna have to understand that I'm a hot mess these days, and it's either I make these videos or I don't. But yeah, I think it was a cute, insightful read. I did feel like the 2 volumes didn't really feel like 2 separate works. Like, even though it's like, multiple volumes, I still expected them to each have their own arc or whatever, but it just reads like one big story. So I couldn't help but think, why not just make one big book? But maybe a 600-page manga would have been a bit too much, so they had to split it into 2. But the bridge between the 2 books were very abrupt. It's like we stop abruptly and then we start back abruptly where we left off. So if you're reading this, I would highly recommend that you just read both volumes in one go, as opposed to read one and then wait to get the other one. The next book that I read was The Sun and Her Flowers by Rupi Kaur, and I freaking loved it. Yup. I know a lot of people are not a huge fan of modern poetry because they find it to be unartistic or whatever, but I thought that this show was good. I usually have a love-hate relationship with poetry, so I wasn't exactly sure what to expect from this. And while the author's experiences are so completely different from mine, she's talking about being a child of immigrants and coming out of an abusive relationship and stuff, and even though her experience is so different from mine, the emotions that she's processing resonated with what I'm also going through at the moment. As I said, my life is a hot mess right now, and I'm fine, but things could be better in terms of my life in general. And I'm experiencing a lot of emotions because of it, some anger, some despair, and Rupi Kaur herself is going through those types of emotions, so she's expressing it in this book, and that just really deeply resonated with me. I wasn't going into this to look for no deep literary experience to interpret metaphors and imagery and all that kind of that. Bitch, I don't have time for that shit. I like the punchiness and the simplicity and the illustrations and all the different things that were incorporated into how she told her stories in here. I get why people like it. I get why people find this so appealing, because at the end of the day we all feel pain. So deep. The next book that I have to talk about is Next Year in Havana by Chanel Clayton. So this one is a historical fiction / contemporary novel set in Cuba. In 1958, we're following Elisa, who is the daughter of a sugar baron, and he's super duper wealthy, and they belong to the very, very like elite of Cuba, and they're in cahoots with Batista. So obviously they were part of the people who were targeted by the revolution that is or was brewing in Cuba at the time. And conflicts of interest start to happen when Elisa ends up falling in love with a revolutionary who's fighting beside Castro. Fast forward to 2017, we're following Elisa's granddaughter, Marisol. Marisol was born and raised in Miami and is journeying to Cuba for the very first time in her 30s because her grandmother, Elisa, passed away and she's taking her ashes to spread them there. And then while she's there, she ends up in a little bit of a love affair of her own and also ends up discovering some deep, dark family secrets. Like the fact that her grandmother was banging one of Castro's men. The sex wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. Y'all can unsubscribe now, it's fine. But yeah, I thought this was okay. I felt like the story itself was extremely engaging, very well written. The kind of book, like once you crack like the first 100 pages, you're just in deep and you're just going to keep reading until you're done. It's very, very gripping. It's a little bit more heavy on the politics than it is on the romance. So if you're going into this expecting more of a light, fluffy, romantic, historical fiction, you're not really going to get that. It's really more so about the politics than it is about the romance. I enjoyed Elisa's story a lot more because I find the historical representation of Cuba to be a little bit more interesting and fascinating. Particularly with the revolution, you know, tensions were high, stakes were higher, you know, the romance was a little bit more star-crossed as opposed to Marisol. And I also just hated how Marisol's ending was. Like, the ending of her story was so abrupt and so weird and so convenient and just didn't really make sense with the rest of the book, which seemed to be a story that was about addressing like the complexities and the nuances of life. And for a book that tries to go there but then ends like that, it just didn't really make any sense for me. But the main thing that I didn't really like about this book was that I felt like the privilege of the two main protagonists were not really unpacked. These are white women, right, who are descendants of white colonizers who owned slaves, right, on sugar plantations, right? They're literally living off of slave money, and both of these main protagonists are super duper 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 super uber rich, right? Because of the slave money that they inherited. And I felt like that privilege, even though it was acknowledged at times for sure on the page, I felt like it wasn't really unpacked. And for that reason, I would urge anybody going into this book to not take this as like a be-all end-all of Cuba, because you're not really getting the perspective of like what the majority of Cubans are going through or went through. It's really just a representation of two very particular minority Cubans, one from Cuba and one from the diaspora. So I urge you, if you're reading this book, I don't know if I'd recommend it because I didn't really care for it all that much, but I urge you, if you're reading it, to just be wary of that before you go into it. That's all. I forgot to say though that we read that book for Bashment Book Club, which is a Caribbean-based book club that I host with Paige and Linnell. We had a live show for it, so if you'd like to see more of our in-depth spoilery thoughts, I will leave it up there. But I also read for Bashment Book Club in November. We are having the live show for this one in November, and that is With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. This book follows a 17-year-old girl named Imani who has a passion for cooking, and she's extremely, extremely talented. In fact, the book has somewhat of an aspect of magical realism because whenever anybody tastes her food, it like triggers a memory or something like that. And the way that the book is written is also very whimsical in a way. Like, it's not very linear, like we're in the plot 1 minute, but then we're, you know, in a flashback the next minute, sort of experiencing this little anecdote about her life. I love when authors write stories like that, where we have a linear story, but we get a little bit of like flashbacks to sort of build context and shape the character as a person. I think that's a really brilliant way, especially for certain books like this, to build a character. So I really love that, but more so I love what this story was about. It's essentially about Imani learning that, you know, she's deserving of greatness, she's deserving of being successful, growing up in a working class black community and having her only interest be something that is culinary arts. She doesn't necessarily think that she has a bright future ahead of her, especially because she's a teen mom. She has a 2-year-old daughter, she's working a really stressful side job, and she has to help her elderly grandmother out at home. So she has a lot of stuff going on, and she doesn't really feel like she could achieve anything or she could take advantage of anything, but the entire story is about her learning that she is capable. So I really like that. I love that this was a positive representation of a woman, a young girl, a young woman who is a teenage mother. I think that's so incredibly important because we often sensationalize teenage mothers and portray them to be nothing but hot messes and like a joke and something to be entertained by. And here we have the representation of a young girl who's a teen mom who's incredibly responsible, who, you know, being a teen mom is a huge part of the story, but isn't ultimately what the story is about. You know, it's like she kind of just so happens to be. And I think that that was so incredible, seeing that dynamic, the dynamic that she has with the child's father and how she takes care of her child. I thought that that was just a really wonderful thing to see, because oftentimes when we think about young adult literature and the young adult experience, we don't consider that some young adults are also parents. So I'm really glad that this book took the liberty to address that and put it in the story. Jesus, I am sweating. Whew, okay. I should have shaved under my arms, sorry y'all. The next thing I want to talk about is I love the relationship between food and the main protagonist in this book. The main protagonist, as I said, loves to eat and loves to cook. Well, she loves to cook. I guess she loves to eat too. I love to eat, I know that for sure. My good friend Jessie from Both Ties and Books often explains how food is a really like an integral part of various, you know, black and brown cultures, which is true, you know, from my own experience and from knowing about other people's experiences. Food is a huge part of our culture and our history. And as Jessie rightfully said, it's also about connecting to that history and invoking memory and invoking, you know, particular feelings and moments that have to do with or that are tied to your culture. So I really enjoyed that aspect of this book as well. There were some minor things here and there that I didn't really care for, like the fact that this book is kind of long. It's almost 400 pages and I felt like it didn't really need to be that long. I wasn't super engaged in the plot itself. I was more so invested in the characters. So when the book started dragging on and on about them, you know, trying to organize something that was going on in the book, I just didn't really care. So I skimmed a little bit of it. I could have also done without the main protagonist. I could have also done without the main protagonist. I could have also done with... Sorry, I just realized I was letting go of a breath I didn't know I was holding. Listen, the writing in here is absolutely fantastic, and Elizabeth Acevedo is a brilliant writer. But it's 2019, that line, I let go of a breath I didn't know I was holding, has become a meme at this point, and I feel like young adult authors should just take note of that and stop writing it in their books, because people just gonna make fun of your books. But yeah, overall it was a great read. I really enjoyed it. Highly recommend it. The next book that I have to talk about is 10 Things I Hate. Sorry, I wasn't letting go of a breath I didn't hold. Like this time I really like, it was about to sneeze. Right, so the next the next book that I have to talk about is 10 Things I Hate About Me by Randa Abdel Fattah. This one is a YA contemporary novel set in Australia, and it was published back in 2006, y'all. Back in the olden days when dinosaurs in the form of Miley Cyrus wearing a blonde wig used to roam the earth. And speaking of like living a double life, this book is kind of along the same lines. This one is about a girl called Jamila Tawfiq who is of Lebanese Muslim heritage. But the school that she's attending in Sydney is predominantly white and predominantly racist. So because of that, she decides to disguise herself as a white girl. So basically nobody in school knows that she's white. She goes by Jamie instead of Jamila, and she dyes her hair blonde and wears blue eye contact. So right off the bat, you know, that's what the story is pitched as. You get the impression that this is a story about a young girl who's ashamed of who she is and is pretending to be white. But when you read it, it's so much more than that. For example, I feel like half of the story is not even set in school, it's set in her home. And the book is really about her, this young girl, navigating two very different identities that she can't really seem to connect. She has to pretend to be one person in school and she has to be another person at home. It's like a typical, like, you know, child of immigrant stories, you know, them navigating these different environments and different identities and negotiating like who they are as a person and all that kind of stuff. So it might seem a little bit cliche, but this book was published in 2006, so it was probably one of a kind back when it was published, especially in like an Arab Australian context. So I really loved that aspect of this book. I think it had a lot of productive things to say about identity, about the main protagonist's culture, about racism, about all sorts of different things that she's experiencing because of the cultural context or contexts that she's in. And as I said, this story isn't really about her being ashamed of who she is. I went into this thinking that she didn't like being Arab, but she loves being Arab. She loves being a Muslim. She's incredibly proud of it. And she's pretending to be white in school not because she's ashamed of herself, but she's trying to protect herself from social suicide and from bullying and from racism, which is a valid enough reason, I guess. I guess this is a good point for me to say that the story at times was a little bit predictable. There were certain things that I didn't really find to be quite realistic, like how she hid the fact that she was Lebanese when, you know, her name would be on the roll call. Like, she has a whole Arabic name on the roll call, and it's very convenient. I find that the teachers refer to like the other students by Mr. Clarkson or Miss this or Miss that, but they just call her Jamie. Does she have some kind of like arrangement with the teachers where she's like in on it? I don't know, that's never clarified on the page or anything. And there were a couple instances like where the book was a little bit 2006 for me, if you catch my drift. Some of the characters remarked certain things or came to certain conclusions that I felt was like, okay. But in the grander scheme of things, I don't really feel like any of those things matter, because this book wasn't ultimately about whether it's super duper realistic to hide the fact that you're Arab, or, you know, all those little things, or whether it's predictable or not. The story was ultimately about this young girl learning about herself and coming to terms with her identity, and it does that flawlessly. The writing in here is really great. The friendship dynamics that we get to explore is really, really fantastic. She has a friend in school who she has trouble connecting with because she has to be sort of secretive about her home life, but her friend is also being secretive about her home life, so the two of them kind of have to sort of navigate this relationship where they really like each other and they want to connect with each other, but they're holding back. So I really enjoyed that. There was another friendship that she started with a guy online. She started this email sort of friendship. Obviously it's set in 2006, so they well, I mean, it was published in 2006. I don't know if it's set in 2006. So she was emailing this guy who she didn't know. It was like this anonymous exchange, and they were just being very open with each other. It reminded me very, very much of Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda. So if you like that kind of like email relationships or whatever in books, and you don't know who the person is and it's revealed in the end who it is, then you'll probably like this one. And my favorite thing about this book was hands down the family dynamic. I love reading about Jamila and her relationship with her dad and her sister and her brother, and how, you know, their mother passed away when they were really young, so they kind of had to, you know, develop this dynamic that's a little bit challenging for them and their dad without their mother. So that was really interesting to read about as well. There's so many other things that I could touch on with this book and how fantastic it was. Rana Abdel Fattah is the author of The Lines We Cross, which is one of my favorite young adult books of all time, my favorite young adult book of all time. So I wasn't surprised that I really, really enjoyed this book, with the exception of a few minor unimportant things. It's definitely a backlist and an underrated one at that, but I really, really, really highly recommend that y'all check it out because it's so freaking good. Whew, y'all, this cold and my sweating is just, I have one more book to talk about and then it's over. I could stop filming. The last book, the final frontier. Isn't that a book? By Brandon Sanderson or something? Or was it Star Wars? Bitch, I don't know. So the last book that I have to talk about is It's Not About the Burka, which was edited by Mariam Khan. This is a non-fiction collection of essays that were written by various Muslim women, all of whom are based across the UK. The collection was born out of the author's desire to write against the narrative that is pushed about Muslim women, particularly in the UK, and how the UK media and the UK government use Muslim women, and they create this narrative about Muslim women that they use to justify Islamophobia and justify particular treatments towards particular Muslim communities in the UK. So this book is essentially Muslim women sort of taking back the pen and regaining control of their own narrative and talking about their experience from their own perspectives. And they talk about so many different things. They talk about representation, they talk about sexuality, they talk about the hijab, they talk about queerness, mental health, race, feminism. Like, they touch on everything in this book. If you are a fan of like non-fiction feminist books, I highly recommend this one. This is a good one for that list. My favorite essays in here were particularly by Nafisa Bakar and Afia Ahmed, both of whom wrote excellent essays on Muslim representation and the kind of hypocrisy surrounding Muslim representation. I also enjoyed the editor's essay, Mariam Khan. She talked about white feminism. Afshan D'Souza Lodhi had an excellent essay about being a queer Muslim and about the hijab and what that means for her as a Muslim woman who wears the hijab kind of on and off. She doesn't wear it all the time. Amna Salim had the most hilarious essay in this book. She's a comedian, so naturally it was very funny, but she talked about a lot of serious things too. She talked about the struggles of being a quote-unquote progressive Muslim, a Muslim who, you know, fights for your own Muslim community, but also fights against a lot of things present in the Muslim community, like sexism and homophobia and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, Muslims within the community don't like you because you're here talking about feminism and all that kind of stuff, and they don't want to hear that. But people outside of the community who already don't like you because you're a feminist also don't like you because you're a Muslim. So you're in this, like, you know, particular intersection where basically everybody hates you, even the people you're fighting for. which is depressing. Raifa Rafiq had an excellent essay in here about being a black Muslim woman in the UK and how Muslimness in the UK is often associated with being Desi or Arab and not necessarily with being black, and how oftentimes the burden of representing Islam in the black community is often placed upon the shoulders of black Muslim women. Really, really interesting. And Malia Buatia had the best essay in this book, and she really sort of brings it full circle to what the title is alluding to, how the UK media likes to focus on particular things about Muslim women, like some of them wear the burqa, or some of them are oppressed, and they like to hang on to these narratives that Islam is oppressive and that Muslim communities are oppressive, and they use those narratives as an excuse to oppress said oppressive communities. Overall, this collection is really fantastic. It's difficult for me to review it because all of the essays are so completely different. These women come from different fields, they have different writing styles, they're writing about different issues, so to review this book is extremely difficult. That's why I just took the route of just telling you which were my favorite essays. It's my third 5-star book for the year. I only read 3 5-star books for the year, and I've read 28 books so far, so that says a lot about it. Yeah, some of the essays in here weren't all that, but the ones that were great really made it for me. So please pick up this one if you are interested. If you want to read a little bit more non-fiction, it's non-fiction November. You know, if you want to read a little bit more non-fiction, or if you want to read some Muslim stuff, you want to read some feminist stuff, you want to read some stuff based in the UK, pick this one up. It's great. And yeah, that's it for this video. It was a hot mess. Thanks for watching. If you read any of these books, you have any thoughts on them, leave them in the comments down below. Subscribe, give this video a like, share it, follow me on social media, all of that. And all of that being said, I hope you have a lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.